This week, the nation continues to react to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and a high-profile entertainer seems to be on the verge of losing his job in reaction. We'll unpack it all with the panel as the Lion Week in Review gets underway right now. Welcome into this week's edition of the Lion Week in Review. It's a weekly look at the culture, the courts, your state capitol, and your kids. I'm Chris Stigall. Now let's meet the panel. The gentlemen this week behind the stories you read at readlion.com. Josh Mann, our managing editor, Michael Ryan, executive editor, and Adam Wittenberg, our staff reporter here at the Lion. Gentlemen, there's a lot to unpack. We will spend lots of time talking about, as we did last week, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. It's the biggest story, really, probably in the world. They're discussing it internationally. And Michael, I'll start with you, as I know you've been writing extensively about it.
Yeah, I wrote a column for HeartlanderNews.com about the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And what I'm seeing on my X feed is basically that that famous Coexist bumper sticker has been ripped to shreds by the left. All the people on my X feed are saying, how can we coexist with this? I mean, how can you coexist with people who want you dead? That's a good question. One X user says the people who claim to embrace the concept of coexistence are the same people that are impossible to coexist with. Another says that you can roll over and be crushed or crush them over and over, relentlessly, constantly, forever. I say there's another option, and that's for Democrats, if they want to coexist, to get a hold of themselves rather than conservatives' throats. It may take being out of power for years, maybe decades, but it shouldn't take that. All it should take is the murder of a young man who only wanted to talk civilly about our differences using the love of Jesus Christ, but it's not looking like Democrats are going to come around anytime soon. But ironically, it's my position that Charlie Kirk's manner and message may be the vaccine for the Democrats' distemper.
It's a very interesting subject and one we're going to explore a little further later in the show. But Josh, just broadly, we were reacting to this when it was very, very fresh news last week here on the Lion Week in Review. With a week between that time and now, what have you seen in terms of reaction?
Yeah, I just keep thinking about how politics is a tug-of-war, and both sides are pulling against one another, and both sides want to score political points at every turn, it seems. And there's a lot of pressure not to let go and to pull in, and not to pull in any direction but against the opposition. Now, we're seeing some politicians, especially on the right, who realize and recognize the significance of what's happening, and they're not trying to score political points, and they're trying to talk. And so I guess I'm just left a little bit exhausted. It's so we were discussing before the show. Some of us are kind of tuning out a little bit, unplugging from social media. And so one of the things that really has come to my mind is just how social media itself is something of a house of mirrors, that we don't all see the same things on social media. There are people who are convinced that Charlie Kirk said a number of evil things and nearly always said evil things. Well, that's just simply not true. But it's most of what they're seeing is some quotes taken out of context, for example. And so I think it's a wake-up call to how we're consuming information, and how do we verify the truth of things? How do we think critically? To me, it's a really foundational question that America's facing.
And to Josh's point, Adam, I mean, we'll talk about this a little later in the show, too. The fallout with Jimmy Kimmel largely centers around what is the misreporting of the assassin's motives. The suggestion that he was, in fact, a Trump voter or a Trump supporter versus something else entirely, which it ended up being, of course, something else entirely. But depending on who you listen to, you may have been led to believe that this assassin was a Trump voter.
Yeah, and that speaks to the heavy media bias that we see all the time, where there's a problem, blame Trump. Something happens, oh, it's his supporters. Like the guy I wrote about last week, when he heard the news, he go, oh, it could have been one of, Charlie Kirk's fans firing off a gun in celebration. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it reflects that silo mentality, that people are in their particular, political silo. Everyone they hear, everyone they see, like Josh was saying, on their social media feed agrees with them, and they just believe it to be true. true, even though this guy was a raging leftist who hated Trump and hated Kirk and all these things, but yet these people can say it, and then there's even very little accountability. I mean, Jimmy got held accountable, but the damage is done. People hear this, oh yeah, he probably was a MAGA guy, yeah, they're violent,
And Michael, I would just ask, I guess, in conclusion on this part of the discussion, are we better off or worse off for having these siloed entities? I have some thoughts on this a little later as we talk about Kimmel, but it does seem, and we've talked about this before, there is kind of, other than maybe sports, there's really no unifying central hub for information and news anymore. And are we better off or worse off because of it?
Well, I think the last shared national experience was the series finale of MASH, which is way long ago. We're living in different realities. We're living in different worlds. We consume different media. We get different information. We get different perspectives on that information. And I'm not sure it's a good thing. It's the balkanization of the American mind.
Adam, we turn to you now on the church aspect of this. Houses of worship, I have heard, and I know you've reported on, are really starting to overflow. It's also an interesting time for people who lead churches. A friend of mine, who's a pastor, was actually posting on social media this week for pastors that didn't address the Charlie Kirk situation. What does that mean? There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, there definitely is. And so I wrote a story this week that a lot of houses of worship were packed over the weekend. New people coming in, old people coming back, hadn't been to church in a decade or more. And a lot of that was the Charlie Kirk effect. But your question, Chris, about pastors and should they even address this? Well, we've already seen the Trump administration clarify that the law does not prevent churches from talking about politics. Now, I think you can talk about the assassination of a prominent figure and not get political. And that's what churches in general should do. In my article, I mentioned Pastor Jim Cymbala of Brooklyn Tabernacle, a very well-known church in Brooklyn, New York. And he called out pastors, some of whom were even celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk. And he said, this is not the way of God. And he's like, I'm not giving you my opinion. I'm giving you the word of God.
I heard my pastor friend say, Josh, that to suggest, well, we only talk about Jesus here would be to suggest that in Jesus' time, those who died for their faith, those churches weren't discussing those people. He was making the point, he referenced several martyrs in the Bible. And again, not that Charlie Kirk is deified here, don't misunderstand, but just that the idea that you wouldn't talk about why and the motives behind Charlie Kirk's very public assassination wouldn't be discussed from the pulpit because it detracts from the Word of God or from Christ. This pastor friend of mine wasn't buying it. You say?
Well, I had to make a decision this weekend. It just so happened that I was preaching at my church, and I'm part of a rotation right now. My church is looking for a pastor, and it's sort of like the lot fell to me. I mean, I was on the schedule, and so I thought, well, what should I do here? And I knew, and I saw in the people in my church, and there were, our church was 15% more full than usual. I saw them posting. I saw people who'd never post political messages posting tributes to Charlie Kirk. I saw people grieving, publicly online. They're usually not people who express themselves. So I knew that there was a pastoral responsibility. Like, people were coming to church looking for answers, feeling unsure about what's true and how serious is this and what's going to happen. And so, I think pastors have a responsibility to address those things, whether it's political or not. And so we did name Charlie Kirk. We talked about the disappointment that many feel. We talked about the fact that not everybody is agreeing on it, and you may be pretty angry about how your neighbor is dealing with it. And how do we do this as Christians? And my message was, we need to regularly unplug from social media, not ignore it, and still use it. We need to unplug and open Scripture up, which isn't subject to algorithms and emojis and these kinds of things. And, afterward, a lot of people, I think, were grateful that we didn't ignore it, that we didn't just sweep it under the rug or pretend like this isn't a huge issue.
These stories and so much more, so much important writing right now going on at readline.com if you want to read about it and many other stories. When we get back, of course, this dominated everything, and we will continue this very deep conversation on the Lion Week in Review when we get back. Welcome back to the Lion Week in Review. If you missed any of today's show or any previous show, you can always catch this show on YouTube and all the stories we talk about, always at readlion.com. Panel, we jump back into the sights and sounds of cable news. We'd have to start sort of in sequential order this week. There was a lot to unpack, and I think we have to start with the testimony, the speech that probably everyone around the world who was engaged in this story about Charlie Kirk's death was paying attention to, and that was his wife and what she had to say in response.
I will never let your legacy die, baby. I won't. I promise. I'll make Turning Point USA the biggest thing that this nation has ever seen. I promise. Oh, Charlie, I love you. I love you, baby. Rest in the arms of our Lord as he blankets you with the words I know your heart always strived to hear. Well done, my good and faithful servant. When I got home last night, Gigi, our daughter, just ran into my arms. And I talked to her and she said, Mommy, I missed you. I said, I miss you too, baby. She goes, where's Daddy? What do you tell a 3-year-old? She's 3. I said, baby, Daddy loves you so much. Don't you worry. He's on a work trip with Jesus, so he can afford your blueberry budget. And my goodness, am I so humbled to witness Charlie, you alongside Jesus right now, doing what you always want to do, baby. Making heaven crowded, right? That's what it's all about. Making heaven crowded.
This is difficult to watch when it originally was broadcast. It's still difficult to watch a week later. But, Michael, you have to imagine that this woman and her composure and her strength, I can only imagine what it's ignited nationwide.
Well, you don't have to imagine. I mean, the numbers are there. This illustrates one of the few things that I have in common with Charlie Kirk, and that is we both married very well. When I heard she was doing this, I wondered if it was too soon. But this was just absolutely magnificent what she did. It was a beautiful mix of raw grief and steely determination. And the determination that she showed, I know, had a lot to do with the response to his death in the form of all these students that want to start TPUSA chapters, over 50,000 across the nation. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that she showed that the movement isn't going to die with Charlie.
Perhaps one of the most profound moments over the last week was a memorial service at the Kennedy Center featuring RFK Jr. and his thoughts and his friendship with Charlie Kirk. If ever there was someone who understands on a deep personal level a tragic event like this, it's a Kennedy. And I thought what he had to say about his communications with Charlie, very interesting. Take a listen.
And I had a conversation once with Charlie where we were talking about the danger that we both faced from challenging entrenched interests. And he asked me if I was scared to die. And I said to him, there's a lot worse things than dying. And one of those... And chief among those is losing our constitutional rights and having our children raised in slavery. And I said to him at that time, I said, sometimes our only consolation is that we can die with our boots on. We can die fighting for these things. Charlie gave his life so that the rest of us would not have to suffer those fates worse than death. Now it's our job, he's no longer there to lead us, to rush in and fill the breach and win this battle for our country, for God, and for our families. Thank you.
Now, I know that Kennedy didn't necessarily speak in overtly Christian tones, but Josh, when you say there's a lot worse things than death, I believe you got to be a believer to say that. That's kind of what struck me. You?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it accurately represents what you see Charlie Kirk, what he spent his life doing. I mean, he constantly, regularly reminded his audience that his Christian faith was number one, above politics. And so he wanted to and was willing to give his life for his faith, just as Jesus demands. If a man gains the whole world but forfeits his soul, what has he gained? I mean, it's a rhetorical question. Nothing is the answer. And Charlie Kirk lived that out, but he also was fighting to give his kids and future generations the country that we read about, the country that we read about when we read the Constitution and some of our founding documents. And so he was fighting for that, as Kennedy says. And so in both senses, I think Kennedy's right. He gave his life so that the people who listened to him and would heed what he said wouldn't face a demise worse than death.
By the way, as we record this, the news is just constantly pouring in. Very interesting. Adam, your reaction to the Turning Point board unanimously electing Erika Kirk, the new CEO and chair of the board. So she's not messing around. She's taken over where her husband left off.
Wow. I mean, I admire the decision. I admire her courage, and just listening to that speech, like, first, it's impossible not to be moved. If you can hear that and not, tear up, choke up, or just feel for her and the whole situation, I don't know what you are. And then secondly, I think it's very hard to listen to that and believe these lies that she or he or his organization are hateful, racist, bigot, all these accusations that have been lobbed. It just doesn't fit. So I approve of the decision. Thanks for sharing the news.
I'm going to pivot, panel, to sort of the other reaction, the other side of this. So that was the immediate reaction from friends and family of Charlie's. Of course, the people on the left that we've been discussing on the show today who didn't like Charlie Kirk, misrepresent what he stood for, free to say what they like, but the marketplace has begun to react. And one of the places that it was felt, I think the biggest, that made the most news in the last week, was Jimmy Kimmel being indefinitely suspended from ABC and his show, and wanted you to hear the reaction on CNN immediately when that was announced this week.
This is a red line that has been crossed for our industry, for the First Amendment, for the right of people to speak. There was nothing hateful about what was said, and even hateful speech is protected. This is not acceptable. If you are going to run a media organization, it's called a news organization, you have to stand up to government bullying anywhere in the world, and certainly in the United States.
Well, the job should be to speak truth to power, even when there are people who don't like the word truth anymore.
This is an interesting time. Jimmy Kimmel losing his job, at least temporarily, though I suspect probably permanently. Stephen Colbert before that, and CBS announcing they're going to terminate The Late Show altogether. We know as a business model these are hemorrhaging money, but has Jimmy Kimmel, Michael, has he just given ABC an off-ramp for a decision that was probably in the offing anyway?
One would think so. I mean, I don't understand why anyone right of center would ever be watching this guy when he's dripping with contempt for conservatives for years and years. But, this is not about one offensive remark. We've shown in this society, Americans are very forgiving, and he could have survived that. This is about those years and years of dripping contempt for people right of center. Mark Halperin, the journalist, said, for years, broadcast networks shoved a one-sided cultural sermon into living rooms and told the other half of the country to smile through it. No more.
Josh, there's a slippery slope here thing. I do think a little bit. As a guy who's been in broadcasting now for 25 years personally, I can tell you, the FCC is something nobody wants to get crossways with. It was interesting to hear the FCC chairman suggest they were going to take a look under the hood at Jimmy Kimmel's comments this week. I wasn't nuts about that, personally, I'll just say. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, similarly, talking about hate speech. Not nuts about that. I think the marketplace spoke here, Josh. You?
I think you're right. I did appreciate what Matt Taibbi wrote about this, that he says, let me quote him, "Now the organic demise of legacy media, which was definitely already happening and at lightning speed, can't be an unmuddied story." So in his view, he did think well, this FCC kind of language maybe muddies the waters, or at least it's giving the left a little ammunition to say, well, look now, government's, they're caving to government pressure. But I think when you really look at it, that's not what's happening. As Michael said, this is sort of years in the making. And we do have to consider the marketplace. And so free speech is important. It doesn't give late night commentators, the right to sort of be, what do we call it here in America, tenured professors who can never be fired. I mean, and by the way, these aren't journalists. These are late night commentators. And so I think there's also a key difference there.
There is a societal cost. And I think, again, if the marketplace or a professional entity, Adam, you run afoul of the conduct stipulations in your employment agreement with the Herzog Foundation, the parent company of the Lion. They certainly were within their right to terminate you if you say something they disagree with. That's not a First Amendment thing. To be clear, the government didn't get Jimmy Kimmel fired.
I'm reflecting back to what happened just 4 or 5 years ago. Cancel culture. During COVID, during the pandemic, tons of people, mostly on the right, were canceled for not fitting the narrative, for saying something wrong, deplatformed, canceled, all these things. And it happens once or twice now on the left to people that are critical of Trump or, critical of Charlie Kirk, and they're crying, oh, First Amendment, free speech. Where were they 4 or 5 years ago?
Let's go with a little more reaction from this week.
He went out to dinner. I wouldn't have done that. In Washington, D.C., and people started to gather around him, and they were chanting, "You're the Hitler of our time." Okay, first of all, he's not Hitler. Okay, an insult to everybody in the Holocaust to begin with. Second of all, calling somebody Hitler makes it a lot easier to justify things like assassination. Let's put a load of that away, shall we?
So Michael Bill Maher, at least, someone of the left who is no fan of Trump, said, let's stop calling him Hitler. Let's turn the boil down. That's a positive sign, but he was sort of a lone voice.
Yeah, I don't think the suspect in the Charlie Kirk assassination kind of put two and two together, Charlie Kirk and fascism. I don't think he did that on his own. I think this has been a drumbeat from the left for years and years. A number of years ago, after the Gabby Giffords shooting in Arizona, the left tried to blame conservatives, and in particular Sarah Palin, for having a political map with a bullseye on it indicating a district that, Republicans could target. And they blamed that for the shooting, which was not true whatsoever. But now look at the rhetoric on the left and look at what it's probably causing.
Britt Hume on Fox reacted to some of the nastiness from the left.
The reaction to Charlie Kirk is a reflection of what has been the reaction to Donald Trump. Donald Trump has triggered what is widely referred to as Trump derangement syndrome, which refers to an absolute inability to see Donald Trump as anything other than a danger, a threat to society, a national emergency. Charlie Kirk went around the country supporting President Trump by and large, but with his own agenda as well. And the reaction is very similar. It is irrational, it is vicious, it is extraordinarily harsh, and I think, Americans as a people have long thought that ordinary decency requires that you don't speak ill of the dead. You don't speak, certainly not in the immediate aftermath of a death. You don't do that. That's not how Americans react. It's not how most people in the world react. And yet we've seen some of that. And I think that you're right, Brett, that it's been so poisonous and seems so poisonous to so many people that it reflects badly on the American left and therefore to some extent on the political party that represents the American.
Yeah. And so, Josh, the reaction from many on the left now, and we heard it earlier from Van Jones, is the Trump administration is using the death of Charlie Kirk to silence speech. I still don't think that's true. I do think it's important that officials not lean into that, like the FCC chairman and maybe even the attorney general do a bit. But no laws have been passed, nor should there be, of course. But to Britt Hume's point, Josh, decency, not spitting on the grave of a dead man, and certainly not celebrating it. Your employer has every right to disassociate with you if you're going to behave that way. That is a marketplace reaction, entirely different than a law being passed outlawing your speech.
That's right. I mean, one of the things that has been celebrated about social media is the democratization of media. how basically everybody has a voice now. You can say whatever you want. You can post it and people see it. I mean, think about what opportunities did Americans have to express themselves after JFK was assassinated. It was a different time. Now there are many more opportunities to express your views publicly, and you have to bear the consequences of that. And so, but I also would just point out that I really don't know what percentage of Americans are expressing these vile views. I have no idea, because I see a lot, but I don't know what percentage that represents. And that's part of the problem with our social media feeds, is we don't know, is this a representative sample? And the more that AI is involved with the algorithmic search results and things like this and social media feeds, the less transparent that question becomes. I think that's a big problem. Sounds nerdy, it's in the weeds, but I think it's a huge issue.
Chris Hayes on MSNBC said of Jimmy Kimmel getting fired this week, or at least temporarily suspended. I don't know that he's going to be fired, but it seems likely. This renders the First Amendment meaningless, he said. However, someone pulled the tape of Tucker Carlson being removed from Fox, and Chris Hayes' reaction to that, Adam, was he believed he could say anything, no matter how disgusting, and get away with it. Over time, that's not going to work out well for you. Mm-hmm. Direct quote from the same guy on two different dismissals.
Yeah, it's the double standard I was talking about earlier, that when a conservative does something out of line, liberals celebrate it, they want them removed, they're canceling them, they're calling them fascist Hitler and all these things. But then when one of their own is plucked off or, rebuked, reprimanded, it's the end of the world, the end of the Constitution, the end of democracy. Don't buy it. There is real consequences to some of these actions, and sometimes those original consequences were overblown, and the ones now, I believe, are appropriate and are good.
Panel, thank you. Outstanding journalism on this subject. It is a difficult one. It's been a long week for the country, and the tributes continue to pour in. There will be a memorial service this weekend. We'll continue to cover it all at readlion.com. When we get back, we continue to celebrate our 250th anniversary as a country next July with our Faith and Freedom 250 series when the Lion Week in Review returns.
Welcome to Faith and Freedom 250, a series from the Herzog Foundation exploring how faith shaped and continues to shape American life. I'm Darrell Jones. Today we examine how some of the nation's oldest and most prestigious universities, like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, were founded as Christian colleges, but gradually drifted far from their original mission.
A handful of colleges in British North America predate the founding of the United States. These early institutions of higher learning were possible because of the religious freedom found in several colonies, and because the Atlantic Ocean kept them distant from the mandates of the British Crown. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and others all trace their beginnings to Protestant denominations. Their purpose was clear: to train new ministers and promote Christian virtue in the colonies.
And yet the same schools that were built by deeply religious settlers are now among the most secular institutions in America. What happened? How did colleges that once existed to form Christian leaders come to abandon their original mission?
Harvard was chartered in 1636. Yale in 1701. Princeton, originally known as New Jersey College, was chartered in 1746. Each was grounded in a specific religious tradition. Harvard and Yale were Congregationalist, while Princeton was Presbyterian. Among the many factors that affected them in the 18th century was the Enlightenment, this same intellectual movement, which fanned the flames of revolution in America, strongly influenced these colleges.
The Enlightenment and its followers looked to reason and science in the rational known world to make sense out of everything. It was the movement that transformed superstition and home remedy into medicine, alchemy and magic into chemistry and astronomy, as well as feudalism into representative government. The Enlightenment sometimes elevated reason at the cost of the Christian religion. The Bible was no longer seen as the ultimate source of knowledge. Reason was. Scientific discovery and experimentation in the physical, mental, and societal realms suppressed the old ancient ways of doing business at every level. Colleges, established to train Christian clergymen in the old ways, found themselves forced to develop curricula to supplement theology, doctrine, and the languages of ancient texts, as students clamored for instruction in medicine, law, science, and philosophy.
As the reputation of these colleges grew, students with varying views of church and Christianity became interested in attending and earning advanced degrees. As outsiders filled the campus classrooms, the purity of the originally targeted denominations diminished, and religious pluralism became more common. This broadening of the student population led to a belief that the curriculum should be expanded to include a wider range of academic disciplines and subjects of study. With student bodies of more mixed religious backgrounds and creeds, college administrators found themselves in a never-ending cycle of diluting their original missions in order to obtain more students and, consequently, more funding.
As these colleges became larger universities, so did their ambition grow to rival the hallowed ancient institutions of the Old World. In England, the University of Cambridge and the University of Oxford had abandoned their religious foundations to become great centers of scientific research and thought. As the Enlightenment surged ahead, American colleges desired the same prestige as these forerunners in the mother country and underwent dramatic changes in their governing bodies. In time, religious leaders serving as deans, chancellors, provosts, and presidents at American universities were replaced by individuals and boards comprised of more secular businessmen, civic leaders, and educators.
Eventually, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and others like them separated their religious schools from their main campus programs and focused on secular education of their undergraduate and graduate students. Princeton initiated a separate theological seminary in 1812. Harvard started its own non-sectarian divinity school in 1816. Yale followed suit and discontinued compulsory religious classes in 1822. A century later, in 1926, Yale made attendance at chapel voluntary. Between 1935 and 1964, Princeton gradually eliminated mandatory chapel attendance, beginning with seniors and ending with freshmen. These universities changed as the American nation itself changed and became more secular in its culture. Not surprisingly, student membership in specific Christian denominations decreased over time.
These universities also began to reframe their mission statements. No longer were they training pastors and promoting Christian beliefs to combat the evils in the world. Instead, prestigious universities focused more on civil duties and public service in their quest to solve the ills of society. In the 20th century, following the two great world wars, these institutions of higher learning expanded exponentially in their influence in the modern United States and produced massive amounts of students educated with little religious or moral teaching. Instead, their graduates were armed and equipped to meet the desires of Wall Street and Washington with seemingly unlimited resources to fund research in every direction of even the most obtuse topics.
What seemed to be unlimited access to grant money attracted university leaders and boards. The quest for the almighty dollar replaced the original search of the collegiate founders for truth and salvation as the purpose of higher education.
It is ironic that the desire for money, prestige, and notoriety could change the mission and core values of academic institutions founded on the principles of Christian faith. Today, some might use the word faithless to describe these ivy-walled bastions of modern higher education. That kind of transformation would have left their deeply religious founders wondering, how did their beloved Christian colleges drift so far from their original mission?
The story of America's Christian colleges is one of both vision and drift. Vision because faith pioneers built institutions to glorify God through learning. Drift because over time, those institutions slowly traded that mission for one centered on secular prestige. It's a story worth remembering and one that still challenges us today. Thanks for watching Faith and Freedom 250. I'm Darrell Jones with the Herzog Foundation. See you next time.